Good evening and welcome to the first lecture of week one of Roman history and early Christian history and literature. I will be downloading this and posting this to YouTube as well. But I wanted to go over a couple of things before I started in with the actual content of the lecture. The quiz will go out shortly after this. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. One of the things that we have to remember as we study history is that the people in history, while they were human beings and they reacted in many human ways, in many ways are not like us at all. It's been said by a number of different people, the past is a foreign country, the past is another country, we can't get there from here. And part of our job as historians is to understand in what way the past was like our times and in what way the past was not like our times. So the first step in understanding the history of a people, especially people as influential as the Romans were on us, is to understand where they came from and what some of the influences they had were and some of the ways that they thought about themselves. So the first step always, I think, is to think about the geography and the climate. We talked about this a little bit in class on Monday, but it's important to remember that this part of Italy is getting into the Alps, and that you also have mountains that run down the spine of Italy. So as the geology was forming, and as the country was forming, you ended up with lots of little pockets of fertile soil surrounded by very, very rugged terrain. And unlike Greece, which has a lot of really good harbors, there aren't necessarily a lot of good harbors. So the resources were scarce. Places to farm were scarce. And so the various little tribes that grew up in what would become Rome and Italy were very warlike with one another because they were competing for these scarce resources. And we see that competition in the Bronze Age, and we see that competition on into the Iron Age. And part of that is a function of what they had available to them. So we tend to think of farming equipment and we think of steel because steel is so ubiquitous in our time. But they didn't have steel. There was some by the time of the Roman Empire, but it was very expensive and we wouldn't really recognize it as steel. What they had was iron, and iron that was soft. When you're farming in an area that has a lot of rock, you're going to wear out your tools very, very quickly, and those tools are going to be somewhat expensive to maintain. Or if you're still using wooden plowshares and that kind of thing, wooden tools, you're going to have to constantly be remaking them. And that, again, is a strain on resources. So in a way, part of what we have to understand when we think about the Romans is that the resources that they had to build a great civilization like they saw in Greece, or they saw in Egypt, where they would have imported grain from, or they saw in their rival in Carthage in North Africa, is that they didn't have the raw materials that they needed in order to sustain a large population, and they were already warlike. And I think that's something that we have to keep in our minds because we think about the Romans and we think, oh yeah, they had this great big empire, but why did they go out and make an empire? And why was it so important to them to have a backstory for why they should be the conquerors of the known world? They started out as a bunch of tribes. There were Etruscans, there were Romans, there were Sabines, there's some other small tribes, and they fought among themselves. As they did that, they were also being influenced by Greece. So Rome is founded in I wrote it down in horrible numbers. Rome was founded in 753 BC. It's the traditional date for the founding of Rome. Romulus and Remus Rome, or really Romulus after he kills his brother. But by that point, the Greek city-states Athens, Sparta, Corinth, but Athens and Sparta in particular, were already thriving civilizations, and in fact, they're getting ready to enter into the Great Greco-Persian Wars. And the Trojan War that the Greeks would claim as part of their heritage, and that the Romans would claim as their part of their heritage, being descended, as they claimed, from Aeneas, who was son of Priam, that had happened in the midst of antiquity, sometime, we think, between 1194 and 1184. That's the traditional date that's given by Greek historians, but it also has been borne out somewhat by archaeology. There's some evidence that Troy 7 was burned in that time period. So they are looking, they're in this tumultuous period, they're building themselves up, and they're looking over at Greece, and they're seeing that the Greeks don't do things the way anybody else does. And they think they want to copy a lot of this, because the Greeks, when they come out of the Greco-Roman Wars, the Greeks are incredibly rich. They've defeated the largest known power that there is, and then they turn around under Alexander of Macedon and build their own great empire, with Alexander conquering Greece and Persia and coming on down into the Middle East before he dies at a young age. And the Romans are like, okay, yeah, we want that. So they understand that they need to expand beyond their own geography. But they don't understand something that the Greeks had. And I think it's very essential to understanding why Rome ended up the way that Rome did. The Romans, because they came out of these warring tribes, because they were very concerned with keeping up their own side and their clan and their tribe winning. In comparison to the Greeks, they were far more warlike. They were far more patriarchal. Even into the empire, a Roman father had the right patriarchal. Even into the Roman Empire, a father had the right to kill his sons or any other family member that had transgressed. They craved, I cannot spell and talk at the same time. They craved order. And they were master bureaucrats. But they were afraid in many ways of freedom, of the kind that the Greeks practiced. And yet, many of their internal struggles came from a dislike of kings and tyranny. And in fact, as we'll learn later on, part of the reason that Brutus and other conspirators killed Julius Caesar was because they thought that he was trying to make himself king. And these things all come out of this tumult of tribes trying to hold lands that they could feed and develop the resources that they needed to develop for their own peoples. And so they looked at the Greeks and they said, the Greeks have riches and they have land and they have trade and they have all these things, and they have this weird kind of government. They don't have kings, which we've already decided we don't like, for a variety of bad experiences, and they have good reasons not to like kings. So we need to have some kind of similar government. But because they didn't have a real understanding or desire for freedom, the government that they came up with would actually be the precursor to the feudal system, because they came up with this idea that people who were the heads of families and were landowners would have certain amounts of power, and those would be the patricians. And the farmers, plebeians, and the farmers and the shopkeepers and others who didn't own land would be plebeians. Now, if you're studying American history, this should sound somewhat familiar to you because this is very similar to the way that our voting system was set up in the early times in this country. It was based on land ownership and this idea that land ownership somehow conferred dignity and wisdom is an idea that we get directly from the Romans, and in particular from the story of Cincinnatus. And if you know your American history, when you read the story of Cincinnatus, you will immediately think of an important early American leader who was often compared to Cincinnatus. So kind of keep that in the back of your mind. So they developed this society, and along with ideas about government that they borrowed from the Greeks without really understanding them, because they didn't have really philosophers in this time period. You know, the Greeks are busy over here, and they've got Aristotle and Socrates, and they're thinking about Plato, and they're thinking about, okay, what's freedom, and what's wisdom, and what's virtue, and how do we make these things work? You know, what's the point of citizenship? And the Romans are over here going, well, honor means that when I say I'm going to do something, even if I know I'm going to die, I'm going to do it anyway. Very virtuous. But they don't have the philosophical underpinning. They're men of action, not thought. And they borrow from the Greeks, the Greek gods, and they kind of glom that on over top of the ancestor worship that they already had, and household, what were called the household lares, which were basically the spirits of the ancestors. And as they continue to conquer various other tribes and so on, they just keep kind of glomming on, oh yeah, sure, we'll grab this, and we'll grab Mithras, and we'll grab some Egyptians, and we'll grab some various other gods. It's all fine, it's all good. And that's one of the reasons that later on they find Christianity so incredibly threatening. Is that they don't have a real religion of their own. The Greeks are like, well, it doesn't fit with our philosophy, y'all are stupid. The Romans are like, oh, well, you're saying that all these other gods that we've accepted aren't real, and we can't handle that. And they have the beginnings of civilization. You know, they, like I said, in 753, you have Romulus founding Rome, and that kind of becomes the center then from which they go out and they war with these different tribes, or these different other tribes attack them, and eventually they decide that they need to have a standing army. And that is weird, because nobody else is doing it. Everybody else, when they need to have an army, and the Romans up until this point, everybody else is like, okay, it's spring and we've sowed the crops, and these people over here are being uppity, or we want their stuff, and so we're going to call the army together. And even Alexander and even the Persians, you see this ebb and flow in the fighting, and it's because at a certain point they still have to send people home to bring in the harvest. The Romans figure out that if they want to have the kind of conquest that they want, they have to have a standing army. They have to pay the army. And later on, there will be legions that rebel because they are not paid, and armies that set up their own general as emperor because they are not paid. They have to pay the army. And they have to do that by means of taxes. And this is the birth of the greatest bureaucracy of the ancient world. And this is part of the reason that Caesar Augustus sends everybody to be counted. It's for the purposes of taxes. Okay, all of you Jews living in Palestine, I want you to go home to your native town so that we can count you, so we can make sure that we're taxing all of you to pay for the army that's occupying you. It's brilliant. And it made a huge difference, because if you have a standing army, even in the winter when you can't fight, you can train. And the major difference between the Romans and everybody else they fought, especially the Celts in Gaul and the wild German tribes over here in Gaul, in Britain, was that the Romans fought as a unit, and nobody else did. They all felt it fought as individual warriors. It makes a huge difference. So you can see already some of the reasons that we look at the Romans and we say, oh yeah, there are ancestors in thought, there are ancestors in philosophy, there are ancestors in these parts of government, in these ways of thinking about things. And it's as we try to understand where they were, why they did what they did, and how that has come down to us, that we're able to start to enter that foreign country of an earlier age. And it's so very important that we do that. So as you are reading, and on Monday I'm going to give you some primary sources of histories that the Romans wrote about themselves. One of the questions to ask is, what story is being told? And who benefits from that story? Or if you want it in Latin, cui bono, who benefits? If I'm telling the story of the history of Rome, and one of the things that I say is Troy was destroyed by the Greeks, who had a legitimate beef with Paris because he'd stolen Menelaus' wife. But Aeneas fled, and he was so noble, he carried his aged father out of the flames of Troy on his back and held his son by the hand and told his wife to follow behind, and oh, well, she died, but he was still noble. And we are descended from noble Aeneas. And by the way, that story is also claimed, interestingly enough, in the early chroniclers of the kings of Britain when they're looking for a reason why Arthur should be noble. They also claim that the noble Britons were descended from Aeneas. Apparently, on his way to found Rome, he got stuck in the British Isles for about 14 years and fathered a bunch of children, according to the chroniclers. Why is that story of benefit to the Romans? Why is the concept of honor, of benefit to the Romans, what do they mean by it? Why is it so important that in later times, legions who have been held to have dishonored their eagle, their standard, have the eagle taken away and melted down? And it's a horrible, horrible thing. And there's actually a legion that manages to lose its eagle up in what's now Scotland, up above Hadrian's Wall. And the legion is basically disbanded because they're held to have lost their honor. Why is it that in the early days it was considered completely understandable for a leader who had made a promise to the enemy that he knew the Romans wouldn't honor, to come and negotiate and then return to the enemy even knowing that he was going to be killed? That's the story of Regulus, which we'll get to in a few weeks. Why was that sort of the founding thing, the most important thing? Because it comes up over and over again, and the great complaint about the emperors is that they've lost the concept of honor. That after Julius Caesar, who was a conniver, the rest of them are also without honor. And so the old patrician families look at the emperor and the mess the Empire of Rome becomes and say, well, gee, no wonder. Because they're convinced that this is the reason why, and there's these constant attempts to try and bring honor back. So what do they mean by that? Because again, it came down to us. And if you read in American history, if you read in the American Revolution, or you read writings that were written just prior to the war between the states, one of the things you'll see people talking about is, well, I can't honorably support this or that, or I have to go with my fatherland because that's the honorable thing to do, and so on. So think about these things. As you read the text, as you read the primary sources, ask yourself, why are people reacting the way that they're reacting? In what way is what I'm reading making clear that I'm dealing with a foreign culture? In what way do I see things that have come down to us? And why have they come down to us the way that they have? Because there's another wonderful saying about history. This one is also very, very true. Those who do not know history are doomed to repeat it. Not just the facts, not just the dates, but the why of things. And there are many people who will tell you that in our day and age, there are many similarities between us and the dissolution of the Roman Empire. And we need to understand what happened so that we can understand how to possibly avoid those same consequences for poor decisions. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.